I want to broaden out the conversation at one point. Obviously, you were sort of ahead of the game in terms of understanding diet for a hot planet. I think it was a decade old now,
Yeah.
and it is perhaps more timely or more urgent today than it was then, but pretty prescient. But I want to circle around that because I want, one of the I remember 15 years ago, a guy I knew was a great organic farmer. And he said to me, yeah, I'm a good farmer, but really the challenge is going to be how we're going to grow when climate change hits. And that's what we should be figuring out. And he was quite convinced that we need to figure out how to make food in a test tube because of that. But one of the things that we see is the pushing of pesticides and of herbicides as a response to climate change in some way, to deal with, instead of dealing with the root cause, we'll deal with the symptoms. And you've been on that beat for quite some time. And you wrote recently about a new study about the growing risks of pesticide. Talk about the risks broadly speaking, but then specifically this study and why it was so interesting to you.
Sure. Well, and thank you for everything you said. I mean, I think that these topics of understanding how we grow our food impacts climate and what we can do about it's really critical. So what this study did was, for the first time, and it's pretty shocking that this is really the first time we have a systemic review to analyze this. Researchers looked at what do we know about acute pesticide poisoning among farmers and farm workers, people working with pesticides all around the world. How often is it happening? What do we know about those numbers? And what they found was pretty staggering. They found that 44% of farmers and farm workers every year are experiencing some kind of acute pesticide poisoning event. And that's 385 million people. And what is important to understand about that, of course, is that that's staggering enough on its own. But I think what's important to understand is that those incidents themselves are possibly and probably linked to long-term health impacts for those who experience that exposure. But also, I think about those farm workers and farmers in the study as kind of the canaries in our coal mine. If they're experiencing those acute incidences of pesticide poisoning, what does that mean for all of us? What does it mean for the kids who live next to those farm fields? What does it mean to the pregnant women who live next to agricultural fields? What does it mean to those of us who are eating food that have been grown with those pesticides? So it was really a study that helped to really tell the story of this really toxic impact of pesticides, but it's a story that's been going on for many decades. It's not as if it's a new story.
Well, all right, and it also tells a story about how this story is not told, right? I mean,
sure.
Just I think the numbers are shocking, but what's also shocking is that, wait a second, there's never been a study like this before. Like, how is it? How, because the presumption is you drive by a farm and you see somebody spraying and you're like, they wouldn't do that if it was really dangerous. And so how is it that there has been no study like this to this point? Like, that's not supposed to happen.
It's not. And that question, Sam, as you can imagine, gets into a lot of threads around the influence of the chemical industry on the scientific community, the influence of the industry on our public health community, on institutions like the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. But just to back up for a second, this question of, how do we not know this? So I've been tracking these questions of how we grow our food and why we grow our food in certain ways and how it impacts us and the environment for about 20 years. And I have been looking for this number, Sam, for 20 years. So there was a study from 1990 that the World Health Organization did that estimated this question of, how many people are killed every year from accidental exposure and how many people are poisoned every year. And I have been noticing over all of these many years that I've been reporting on these issues, that same number from that 1990 study has been used up until 2017, when a commission on human rights wrote a really powerful report on how pesticides should be seen as a human rights issue. And the only number they had to work with in terms of how people are being impacted was that 1990 number. So just to, stress again how important data is and how politicized data is and how important this report is.
Well, what I mean, was there not another study undertaken over the 30-year gap because people didn't want to know the answer? I mean,
yeah,
or there wasn't anybody with the money who wanted to know the answer?
Well, again, I think what these researchers, and there were from 4 different researchers from around the world that were part of an advocacy group called Pesticide Action Network. So what they were able to do for this study was pull from the hundreds of studies that have been done at local levels and to tell this global story. But I think that what you're getting at with this question of, why don't we know this and why haven't we known this earlier? I think what my colleagues and I have been tracking for a long time is how much money and how much effort and work has been put into the kind of misinformation and disinformation about pesticides by the chemical industry itself. So, and this, this isn't from the past 10 years. We're talking about when Rachel Carson published Silent Spring in 1962, Monsanto and other chemical companies spent a lot of money and a lot of time to discredit her, to call her all kinds of names, many of which were really sexist, and to try to paint her concerns about chemicals like DDT as totally hysterical. So what I have seen in looking at how the concerns about pesticides are downplayed, and we've just so far in our conversation just talked about the public health concerns, to people, but we could have we should add into the conversation the concerns to ecosystems, right?
Right.
A lot of the reason I think that there isn't more alarm is because of a really sophisticated, well-funded disinformation campaign, very similar to what we saw from big tobacco. I mean, how many decades did we all know that tobacco was really bad and cigarettes would kill you if you smoked them too much? We knew that for a long time before there was strong regulation. You could say the same thing about fossil fuels. And I think we're at that moment with pesticides where the industry has really shaped the narrative. And it's a lot of advocates are trying to step in to say, this is as urgent as the climate crisis. This is as urgent as other public health crises to really put pesticides into the crosshairs of advocates' eyes.
All right. Well, I want to talk about how it's affecting the individuals and farmers, and then the sort of the knock-on effects, the people from out there, and then also from an ecological perspective. But you brought up regulation. I'm curious, like what kind of regulation exists if we have such sparse data? Like I get a little bit. Again, that presumption that like, oh no, they wouldn't be able to spray that. And if I was in any danger, you see a house that next to a farm and you don't think twice, like, oh no, they definitely know it's safe because they wouldn't live there. What kind of regulation exists if there hasn't been really any comprehensive data?
Right. Well, there has been, studies done on specific pesticide formulations, and there are these pockets of data out there. But what I think people, to understand what's kind of what are the real barriers to really strong regulation in how we look at pesticides is that the whole framework, especially in the United States, of how we regulate pesticides has not kept up with that data. It hasn't kept up with the science. So let me explain what I mean. So we now understand, again, there is good data to tell us that we really should be regulating pesticides not on their individual formulation and will this particular pesticide have this effect, but we really need to think about them in terms of the kind of chemical cocktail that we are all exposed to. Because sure, malathion on its own might not be an issue, but what about if you're actually being exposed to malathion and also chlorpyrifos and also 2,4-D? What does that chemical soup do to, again, not just people? We care about people. We also care about insects and other entities in our ecosystems. And so, number one, our regulatory environment doesn't do a good job of thinking about that chemical soup. But number two, a lot of the regulation hasn't been based on actually looking at people at different points in their lifetime. So, a grown adult has a different potential, toxic exposure for a grown adult is going to be different than a pregnant woman. is going to be different than an infant or somebody who's elderly or immunocompromised, right? So regulatory environment doesn't really capture those concerns either.
Hi, I'm Sam Seder. You can watch the rest of this interview and more on our Peacock show, which streams at 5 p.m. weekdays on The Choice from Peacock TV.